Hello, friends. Jane Curcio, and welcome back to Breaking Bread for You with Part 2 of Noah and the Flood, with Part 1 presented 2 weeks ago, in which we examined the Nephilim, the giants that existed at the time of Noah. And we will start here where we left off in Genesis 6, verse 8, where it said, "But Noah found grace," or favor in the Greek Septuagint, in the eyes of Yahweh. Noah, who was the ninth descendant of Adam, was commissioned by God to build an ark, a floating superstructure in which he and his household survived the great deluge. Now, there are scholars who argue that the biblical account of the flood is fictional, yet that argument falls apart in light of the numerous ancient worldwide flood traditions from various cultures around the planet. One of the earliest stories of the Great Flood is found in the Sumerian King's List, dated to 2200 BC, which would have been known to Abraham, who lived in Ur of Sumer 4 centuries later. The Sumerian flood epic, discovered in the Ugarit text that dates to 1500 BC, is quite like the biblical account. This is the case with the Mesopotamian Gilgamesh flood epic of the 7th century BC, in which the god Enlil sent a worldwide flood. And there are many parallels in the flood epics of different cultures concerning the details of the ark, the hero who built it, and the animals taken aboard. Yet the outstanding differences are in the nature, character, and purpose of the deity or deities who ordered the building of the ark. In the case of the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, the gods destroyed humanity, not for having been exceedingly wicked, but because they often disturbed these gods with their troubles and requests. But isn't that what the true God expects us to do? Another major difference is that Yahweh cares about humanity that he created, while the pagan gods exploited the people through forced labor. And opposite of Yahweh, who was in total control of destroying all life on earth with the flood, the pagan gods of the ancient Near East became exceedingly frightened by the flood they initiated and cowered through it all. On our side of the world, where Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky are located, long before the advent of Christian missionaries to the Americas, the Chickasaw Nation held to a worldwide flood sent by the Great Spirit Ababanili. According to the Chickasaw flood epic, their ancestors made rafts to save themselves, yet all had drowned save one family and a pair of all animals. And how close to the biblical account is that? And when the rain ceased, a raven appeared with an ear of corn that Ababanili instructed them to plant. Interestingly, the ancient Chickasaw held to a prophecy of the destruction of the world by fire. Similar flood stories have been part of the oral traditions of the Mayans, Incas, and Chinese, validating for skeptics the historicity of the Genesis account. Now, the flood account begins with the genealogy of Noah in chapter 6, verses 9 through 10, who is said to be an Ish Zadik, a righteous man, that is, one who is blameless of sin. Yet at the time of Moses, an Ish Zadik was one who observed all of the law. And listed in Noah's genealogy are his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, without mention of their mother wives or children, as genealogies of ancient Israel typically had done. And in verse 12 it is stated, "So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth." And you might notice the amount of repetition in the following passages, which might be explained by the contribution of 2 sources of the flood account, the Yahwist writer and the priestly writer, whose versions were combined to form the flood epic, not eliminating any of the texts. And in verse 13, the dire situation at the time of Noah is reiterated, where God says, The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. In verse 14, God responds to that by commanding Noah, make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch. Now, the term for ark in Hebrew is tebar, which can be translated ark, box, basket, chest, or coffin. Tebar is used once again for the basket in which baby Moses had been placed for his protection. However, gopher or gopher wood is not so easily identified since it is used only once in the Bible, and horticulturists have confirmed that there is no such wood in the world. But given that large boats were made from cypress in the ancient world, gopher wood might have been an alternative name for cypress, perhaps a variety of it. Unfortunately, the older version of the Old Testament, the Greek Septuagint, does not identify the type of wood used on the ark. So one of our most reliable reference books, Green's Interlinear of the Bible, translated gopher wood as cypress planks. And the pitch used to seal the planks is zepheth in Hebrew, and asphaltoses or asphalt in the Greek Septuagint. Now, in this frame is a replica of the ark in Williamstown, Kentucky that I'm using as a backdrop for verse 15, where it says, and this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, approximately 18 inches per cubit, or around 450 feet. Its width 50 cubits, around 75 feet, and its height 30 cubits, around 45 feet high. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. And it has been estimated that the ark displaced over 44,000 tons of water. Now, there's nothing in the account to indicate that only Noah and his sons built the ark by themselves. It's likely that Noah hired laborers who, although might have helped build the ark, they could not have shared in the vision that God was saving a righteous remnant for himself. Then God reveals to Noah the purpose for the ark in verse 17, where it says, and behold, I myself am bringing flood waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. Noah has been commissioned to build a superstructure in verses 15 and 16, and it appears that time jumps ahead in verse 17 when God tells Noah that he is bringing destruction on the earth, which presumes the ark is completed. And after dropping this bombshell, God tells Noah in verse 18, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And continuing in verse 19, God instructs Noah of another arduous task after the ark is finished, saying, and of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive, and you shall take for yourself of all food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them. And Noah demonstrated his righteousness, where it says, thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him to do. And the story continues in chapter 7, beginning in verse 1, where it says, then the Lord said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Here the doctrine of salvation is developed in that it is attained by being righteous before God, demonstrated by Noah's obedience to God's commands. For me, this is the intended message of the flood story for Israel and the Church of Jesus Christ. And then God becomes more specific in verses 2 and 3 about the animals to be taken on board, commanding Noah, "You shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female. Also 7 each of birds of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of all the earth." The distinction of clean and unclean animals is made here without clarifying the difference. This suggests that Noah already knew the difference long before it was outlined in Leviticus 11, 865 years later. If you viewed my recent study on Cain and Abel, you might remember that I mentioned the plausibility of God giving our first ancestors the regulations of sacrifice, explaining why Abel offered up the firstborn of his flock, a Mosaic regulation of burnt offering. Interestingly, John Sailhammer, a notable Baptist Old Testament scholar, understood that bringing clean animals into the ark points to the tabernacle in the wilderness, where they would be brought before the presence of God, who protected the Hebrews in the wilderness as the ark protected Noah and his family in the flood. And the flood details continue in verse 4, where it says, "For after 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made." And as you know, the number 40 has much to do with God's testing and judgment, which is significant in the case of the flood where God judged the world and where Noah's obedience was proven. And you will recall that Israel had been judged and chastised by serving the Philistines for 40 years. Jonah warned Nineveh for 40 days of impending judgment, and the prophet Ezekiel laid on his side for 40 days, symbolizing God's judgment on Judah. And then, of course, Jesus was tested throughout his 40-day fast. Back to Noah, it says in verse 5, "And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him." Again, his righteousness before God being noted. And beginning in verse 6, it says, "Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. So Noah with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives went into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Of clean animals, of animals that are unclean, of birds, and of everything that creeps on the earth, 2 by 2 they went into the ark to Noah, male and female, as God had commanded Noah." Verses 7 through 9. 6 through 9. Again, it is mentioned that Noah obeyed God's commandments, which some point out looks forward to the mandate to obey the commandments Moses would receive on Mount Sinai some 8 centuries later. It concludes, "And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth." And in verses 11 and 12, it says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month," this is the Jewish month of Iyar, or May 13th, estimated to be the year 2319 BC. "On that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And in verse 13, it goes on to say, "On the very same day, Noah and Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. They and every beast after its kind, all cattle after their kind, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind, every bird of every sort. And they went into the ark to Noah, 2 by 2, of all flesh in which is the breath of life. So those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, increasing about 22 feet, that is, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life. All that was on the dry land died. So here we can say that all species of fish survived. And beginning in verse 23, it says, "So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping things, and birds of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive." And although it is emphasized in verse 23 that all life on earth perished in the flood, let me say here, the point the writer wants us to grasp is that Noah and his household were saved, a righteous remnant. The story is not about death, but about life, not about destroying life, but about saving life, the lives of God's righteous people. Were Noah's family members righteous? It's not said. We know that Ham had a problem, but because Noah was righteous, it might be that his family were covered at least in regard to saving their lives from the flood. And so we can say that as the ark points to the tabernacle of the presence of God where the Hebrews worshiped him, it points to the Church of Jesus Christ, where the redeemed come before the presence of God to worship him. And let me also say here that the judgment of the flood and the salvation of the righteous remnant of Noah and his household points to the great tribulation and the rapture of the church. Now, chapter 7 concludes with verse 24, where it says, "And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days." And that would include the 40 days of rain. And the story goes on to chapter 8 with Noah's deliverance, where it says, "Then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark." Now, God remembering Noah does that indicate he had forgotten him over the past year? Not if the meaning of zakar is examined, which can mean, besides to remember, to be mindful, to consider, and bring to mind. And verse 1 continues to say, "And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water decreased." Then the ark rested in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. In this frame is the mountain range of Ararat, and on the plain in the foreground is Khor Virach, an Armenian monastery that was established in the 7th century. And in verse 5, it continues to say, "And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. Then he sent out a raven, which kept going to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. He also sent out from him a dove to see if the waters had receded from the face of the ground. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot, and she returned into the ark to him, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and drew her into the ark to himself. And he waited yet another 7 days, and again he sent the dove out from the ark. Then the dove came to him in the evening, and behold, a freshly plucked olive leaf was in her mouth. And Noah knew that the waters had receded from the earth. So he waited yet another 7 days and sent out the dove, which did not return again to him any more. This was significant, for olive trees grow in lower elevations, which indicated to Noah that the lower levels had drained and vegetation was recouping. And it says then in verse 13, where it continues, and it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, Go out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with them. Every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, and whatever creeps on the earth, according to their families, went out of the ark. Thank you for viewing part 2 of Noah and the Flood, and I hope you'll return for part 3, where I'll discuss the failure of Noah and Ham and the curse of Canaan. But until then, be blessed in all that you do as you study God's Word.